What other buildings did Solomon build in Jerusalem besides the temple? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of 1 Kings on walking through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing 1 Kings chapter 7, verses 1 to 12. But before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 1. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So 1 Kings chapter 7, beginning at verse 1. But Solomon took 13 years to build his own house. So he finished all his house. He also built the house of the forest of Lebanon. Its length was 100 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits, with 4 rows of cedar pillars and cedar beams on the pillars. And it was paneled with cedar above the beams that were on 45 pillars, 15 to a row. There were windows with beveled frames in 3 rows, and window was opposite window in 3 tiers. And all the doors and doorposts had rectangular frames, and the window was opposite window in 3 tiers. He also made the hall of pillars. Its length was 50 cubits, and its width 30 cubits, and in front of them was a portico with pillars, and a canopy was in front of them. Then he made a hall for the throne, the hall of judgment, where he might judge, and it was paneled with cedar from floor to ceiling. And the house where he dwelt had another court inside the hall of like workmanship. Solomon also made a house like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken as a wife. All these were of costly stones cut to size, trimmed with saws, inside and out, from the foundation to the eaves, and also on the outside to the great court. The foundation was of costly stones, large stones, some 10 cubits and some 8 cubits. And above were costly stones hewn to size and cedar wood. The great court was enclosed with 3 rows of hewn stones and a row of cedar beams. So were the inner court of the house of the Lord and the vestibule of the temple. In chapter 6, we discussed the building of the temple. What we saw was a magnificent structure that Solomon built to worship God in. It was double the size of the tabernacle and was thus a permanent structure, contrasted with the tabernacle that could be moved from place to place. Instead of having walls of tapestry and wood, Solomon's temple was made of hewn stone. The insides were then covered in wood overlaid with gold. Even the floors were wood overlaid with gold. The most holy place of the tabernacle, where the Ark of the Covenant would be placed, was more magnificent than that of the tabernacle, having additional cherubim placed within, whose wings stretched the entire width of the room. The most holy place was separated from the holy place of the temple, not simply by a veil, which was still present, but by 2 large doors as well that were covered in gold. The same was true of the doors separating the temple from the courtyard. Gone were the fabric screens used in the tabernacle, and in its place a more permanent and seemingly sturdier separation. And with how tall the structure stood, the equivalent of a 3-story building, and its placement on Araunah's threshing floor, which is about 400 feet or 125 meters higher than the lowest point in the city of David, it meant that the temple could be seen from afar off, a constant reminder for the inhabitants of Jerusalem of God's presence. Here at the beginning of chapter 7, the author takes a short break talking about the temple to tell us of the building of Solomon's palace. He tells us that Solomon's palace took 13 years to build. 1 Kings 9 verse 10 will reveal to us that this time was not concurrent with the temple, but consecutive, meaning that it took 20 years to build both the temple and the palace of Solomon, which turns out to be half of Solomon's reign. Now, some might take a look at the time Solomon spent building his palace when compared with the time spent building the temple and claim that Solomon was being materialistic or had his priorities in the wrong place. But such a judgment is rather misguided for a couple of reasons. First of all, the temple was built first. In Ezra's day, we're going to find God complaining to Judah that they left the house of God unfinished while rebuilding their own houses. Solomon built the temple of God first while living in the palace built by David, his father. It was only after the temple was finished that Solomon turned to his own palace. But second, we need to look at the size of Solomon's palace. What we have told to us here is that Solomon's palace was actually 5 buildings: the house of the forest of Lebanon, where we will find the arms kept, the hall of pillars, the hall of judgment, where his throne would be, as well as 2 personal quarters, one for him and one for his wife, Pharaoh's daughter. This latter building is also where Solomon likely kept his other wives too, but as of yet we have only read of this wife. The house of the forest of Lebanon was 150 feet long by 75 feet wide by 45 feet tall. The hall of pillars was 75 feet long by 45 feet wide and had a portico of pillars and a canopy in front of it. We aren't given here the size of the other buildings, but you would have to imagine that they would probably be comparable in size to the other parts of the palace. My point is that Solomon's palace was a massive complex that required much stone and woodwork to finish. So that it took significantly longer to finish shouldn't surprise us or cause us to think that Solomon's priorities were somehow out of whack. Did Solomon need these buildings? Well, does any of us really need the large houses that many of us have? No, but with wealth usually comes bigger houses. And as king, Solomon desired a bigger palace than his father had built in the city of David, one that reflected his wealth. In Ecclesiastes, we're going to find that Solomon is going to warn us that wealth doesn't equal happiness, and so while these buildings wouldn't make Solomon happy, they would be an expression of his wealthy status as king of Israel. Grand buildings to behold, I'm sure. Taking a look at the map on our screen now, you can see how Solomon is expanding Jerusalem during his reign. The Palace of David represented the northern boundaries of Jerusalem in David's day. The temple construction and Solomon's palace expanded Jerusalem even further, increasing its area. But even with this expansion, Jerusalem is not to the size that it would eventually become in the days of Hezekiah or in the days of Jesus, but it is growing. We'll return to discussing the construction of the temple, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 1 Kings chapter 7, verses 13 to 26, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.